You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
That's what President Johnson said about the situation in Vietnam in 5 years later. His successor, President Richard Nixon, continued to inform the American people about their adventure in Southeast Asia. But there was no victory to be seen. All Nixon announced was an agreement that many still refer to today as the Paris Agreement of 9/7. So why did the US agree to sign? This agreement. The story begins with the Tet Offensive of 9. We have a specific video about this event. You can click on the link to see the details. The immense shock from the Tet Offensive of 1968 forced the U.S. to sit down at the negotiating table with Vietnam because this event made the U.S. realize that victory over the North was too far-fetched. The American people also gradually lost support for their government. They could no longer be optimistic when they saw the U.S. pouring tons of resources into Vietnam but still suffering terrible losses. This led President Johnson to declare on the night 1/19 the U.S. agreed to negotiate with Vietnam, seeking a way out that would both appease public opinion and allow them to leave the battlefield honorably. However, the Vietnamese side did not immediately accept the negotiation proposal. Let's go back to understand this move by Vietnam during the bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The Gen's administration also used diplomacy to exert pressure on Hanoi. Specific. The U.S. demanded unconditional negotiations from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Hanoi accepted this demand because it was wary of the U.S. military strength, which would give the U.S. the upper hand in. During this period, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam persistently held its ground on the battlefield, waiting for an opportunity to reverse. Similar to President Johnson's new proposal, Hanoi needed to ensure that the U.S. could not hold the upper hand, because even though Johnson agreed to stop bombing North Vietnam, he still allowed aircraft to attack areas along the demilitarized zone, and he also included the condition that Hanoi should not take advantage of the situation at that time. Providing aid to the South was contrary to Hanoi's demand for a complete and unconditional cessation of bombing. However, if North Vietnam proposed such a rigid approach, it would be impossible to win over the global wave of peace demands. Therefore, Vietnam only initiated exploratory contact, which was the first step in the strategy of fighting and negotiating, and also opening shot of the first phase of the Paris peace talk. Participating in this phase were the U.S. and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam delegations, led respectively by Ambassador Everell Haran and Foreign Minister Xuan Thay. The first official meeting took place on May 13, 1960. The positions of Hanoi and Washington were extremely different. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam resolutely demanded that the U.S. completely and unconditionally cease bombing North Vietnam before proceeding with official negotiations, while with its strong commitments to Nguyen Van Thieu insisted on conditions accompanying the cessation of easing. The two sides continuously clashed for 5 months without reaching any significant agreement. Crucial leverage point emerged in the 1960 U.S. presidential election. The race for the White House saw a competition between two candidates, Herbert Humphrey of the Democratic Party and Richard Nixon of the Republican Party, against backdrop of a raging anti-war movement in America. Furthermore, with Nixon leading Humphrey, Johnson faced immense pressure from his own Democratic Party. He needed to do something to advance the Paris peace talks and give Humphrey an advantage. Unfortunately, that was to completely and unconditionally stop bombing North Vietnam. The Saigon government, believing Nixon might sought obstruct contact between Washington and Hanoi, fearing that if they facilitated Nixon's path now, Nixon favor South Vietnam once he became president. Under pressure from the Democratic Party, Johnson decided to go with the flow. In '68, Harry Yan revealed the American card the United States was ready to stop bombing when that led to a resolution. The serious talks implied that the U.S. would accept the complete cessation of bombing in North Vietnam if the Saigon government was allowed to participate in negotiations. Furthermore, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam would be permitted to attend the Paris peace. The front's presence would increase the international recognition of this regime, thereby further spreading Vietnam's desire for peace. This could also provide additional impetus to the anti-war movement, which was already very active in the US and around the world. Of course, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam did not accept Minister Xuan. They had to ask many times to confirm that the US cessation of bombing in North Vietnam was complete and unconditional. The US deputy also confirmed that this was not a condition, not a reciprocal demand, but simply a definition of serious talks. Thus, the first obstacle in the negotiations was removed. Xuan they officially informed the US side that the four-party talks in Paris would begin after the US completely and unconditionally stopped bombing. 10 days after President Johnson declared an end to all bombing raids on North Vietnam. 19, Nixon took office as President of the United States. The victory in Phase 1 belonged to the Vietnamese side. The host republic, Xuan Thui's delegation, demonstrated the necessary firmness, thereby ensuring the initial objectives were met. On January, the party meeting officially began. Not only the Vietnamese but also the Americans eagerly awaited the end of the war. They expressed their opposition through protests, even resulting in fatalities. Most. The Kent State incident in 1970, where 6 students were killed and much infrastructure was destroyed. The situation in the United States at that time was described as a state of extreme frenzy. Public pressure within the United States played a crucial role throughout the Paris conflict. This factor was most evident in Phase 2 of the negotiations, a prominent feature of which was the deadlock, to the point that many described the Paris conference as a meeting of deaf people, talking to each other for months. With the conference stalled, the only lively activity between the two sides was mutual accusations. It wasn't until that the head of the National Liberation Front delegation, Tran Vu Kien, finally presented a 10-point solution, emphasizing major issues first, the U.S. unilaterally assisting all its troops and allies out of South Vietnam. Secondly, that the internal affairs of South Vietnam would be resolved by the people of South Vietnam themselves, and the establishment of a coalition government aiming for free elections. American public opinion immediately reacted when Tran Vu Kien announced the 10-point solution. They were already fed up with the war, so when a way out appeared, regardless of whether it aligned with the government's vision, they all responded positively, especially when they saw that the 10-point solution mentioned the exchange of prisoners of war, as among American soldiers who fought in Vietnam were their husbands, fathers, and sons. Many American prisoners of war were also sons of powerful families, which made the U.S. Congress uneasy, but Nixon was not easily swayed. The U.S. president presented an 8-point plan. This was America's response to the previous 10-point plan. The main points of this plan emphasized 2 things. Firstly, both American and South Vietnamese troops must withdraw from South Vietnam. Secondly, an international committee must be established to oversee the election. The 10-point plan and the 8-point plan were completely contradictory. They only had one thing in common: the exchange of prisoners of war. However, the overwhelming pressure of American public opinion forced Nixon to compromise. The U.S. unilaterally carried out the first troop withdrawal. This action also marked the beginning of the Vietnamization strategy. While the U.S. withdrew its troops, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam remained, which was a thorn in Nixon's side. In a secret meeting between Kissinger and Nixon. During a meeting with Xuan Thiwi, the U.S. expressed its position. They set a deadline for withdrawing troops from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on 1970, and threatened severe retaliation if the North did not withdraw. Phan Lai refused, arguing that in his view, North and South Vietnam were one, and was the only foreign power. Therefore, troop withdrawal was necessary. Pressure from the anti-government movement in the U.S. forced Nixon to continue withdrawing troops. By 1970, the U.S. had withdrawn approximately 150,000 troops South Vietnam in fixed phases. Unsatisfied with the slow withdrawal, the Vietnamese side continued to demand a faster and complete withdrawal. Even the Provisional Revolutionary Government exerted counter-pressure by setting a deadline for the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops by June 30, 1970. But the U.S. was not to be outdone. They believed that continuing to provide troops would put them in a weak position, thus further weakening the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Republic further delayed agreeing to the American proposal. If negotiations for the North's troop withdrawal were unsuccessful, force would be the only. Instead of bombing Hanoi, the U.S. bombed Laos and Cambodia in an attempt to cut off the supply lines between North and South Vietnam. This was seen by American public opinion as an unprovoked escalation that would spread the war in Vietnam throughout, costing the U.S. more money and time. Members of Congress even considered the attack on Cambodia a baseless argument and a tragic. Besides bomb, the U.S. also moved closer to the Soviet Union and China, two countries that had provided significant support to North Vietnam. Da Tenta would indirectly put pressure on Vietnam, the Democratic Republic, through urged the Soviet Union to limit supplies to Hanoi. But this move by the U.S. could not defeat the will of the Vietnamese people. The U.S. only saw itself once again burdened with pressure, withdrawing more troops. 1970. The four delegations had reunited. This reunion saw a notable change in the leadership of both sides, most notably the U.S. delegations. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's delegations. Advisor Le Duc Kissinger offered Le Duc though a proposal the U.S. was willing to unilaterally withdraw troops, provided that North Vietnam did not launch an invasion of South Vietnam via Laos and Cambodia. Unfortunately, Vietnam did not accept this proposal. Thus, it was not Vietnam, but the American people themselves who gradually deprived the country of alternative options at the negotiating table. From bargaining to escalating military action, all were under tremendous pressure from the fervent anti-war movement. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam also took advantage of the situation and bluntly rejected unfavorable proposals. As a result, over the course of 3 years, the U.S. essentially withdrew almost all its troops from Vietnamese territory. By mid-1972, only 69 remained in Vietnam, ready to return. This small number of troops put the U.S. at a significant disadvantage at the negotiating table. Kissinger's negotiations ultimately yielded concession. He accepted an unconditional troop withdrawal, while allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South. This was a breakthrough that resolved a deadlock in the negotiation. The remaining deadlock would be resolved in Phase 3 if significant turning points emerge on the battlefield. The remaining deadlock we are referring to is the formation of a coalition government. The Nguyen Van Thieu regime was the biggest obstacle. Thieu resolutely opposed the coalition government solution because it could limit his power. The North would exploit this to hold a free general election to unify the two regions under the leadership of the Communist Party. For a staunch anti-communist like Thieu, this was, therefore, to form a coalition government. The first thing to do was to remove Thieu. This was also Vietnam's demand at the negotiating table. From the latter half of 1970, the U.S. was not easily willing to accept this. Doing so would be tantamount to betraying an ally in the context of war. Abandon another ally would cause other allies to lose faith in the U.S. even more. Furthermore, Thieu's regime would help keep the Republic of Vietnam standing after the U.S. From the U.S. perspective, they had already conceded on the withdrawal issue. Now it was Vietnam's turn to make concessions. Facing a deadlock in, the Communist Party decided to launch a large-scale campaign. The Spring Offensive of 1972. In the early days of the offensive, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam successfully controlled important areas, such as Quang Tri, Thu Thien, and Quang Nam. The U.S. also used this as a pretext to launch a devastating campaign against North Vietnam aimed at cutting off supplies to the south. The Republic of Vietnam Army was initially, but with the help of American experts, it gradually recovered. Around the end of September 1972, facing the situation where the Saigon Army was regaining strength and the U.S. was reaching its final stages, Vietnam decided to bring a concession to Paris on. In 1972, Le Duc Tho revealed his trump card. He temporarily set aside the removal of the Thi regime, accepting the existence of two parallel governments in South Vietnam. Vietnam's acceptance of the Thi regime was also part of a strategy to drive the Americans out first, and only then to defeat the puppet regime. The U.S. also offered some flexibility, as they themselves had suffered significant losses after Operation Labor I. They accepted a tripartite electoral committee, consisting of the Provisional Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and a neutral faction. These concessions from both sides brought about a significant breakthrough in the negotiations. I was truly delighted to receive Le Duc Tho's proposal, to the point that he had to be optimistic. We succeeded. In the following days, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the U.S. gradually resolved their remaining disagreements, and the shape of a peace agreement became increasingly clear. Both sides agreed to sign it on October 20, 1970. The only issue now was persuading Nguyen Van Thieu to accept it. This agreement was signed by a stubborn American ally who, despite countless sweet words and threats from Kissinger, steadfastly rejected the peace agreement. He did not accept the continued presence of North Vietnamese troops and refused to acknowledge the existence of the Provisional Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Having gained this advantage, and with Nixon's backing, Kissinger had no other choice but to take Thieu's proposed changes to the agreement back to Paris. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam vehemently protested, claiming that the U.S. was deliberately prolonging. The talks continued to be deadlocked, and once again, the U.S. used military force to resolve the situation. On December 1970, the U.S. continued its air raids on North Vietnam under the name Operation Linebacker II, dropping over 36,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi, Hai, and other provinces. This retaliation against the Vietnamese resulted in the Dien Bien Coup victory and the Day and 12th Night Air Campaign by the U.S. Air Force over North Viet. For 12 days and nights, the Vietnamese people received free aluminum to complete the floating structures. It is likely that B-52 bombers were shot down, and this military defeat pushed the U.S. to the brink. On 19, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho met again in Paris. All of Nguyen Van Thieu's demands for changes were set aside, and both sides returned to the agreement they had planned to sign on October 20. 9-2. Faced with the U.S. defeat, Kissinger finally signaled to Nixon that he accepted the final agreement. 1970. The Paris Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was officially signed. This agreement resolved almost all the issues between the U.S. and Vietnam. For the U.S., it was peace with honor. Bringing troops home, calm in the rage and anti-war flames in the land of the Republican flag. It was a diplomatic victory. Important, it was U.S.'s recognition of Vietnam's rights, the fundamental principles of the Vietnamese nation, and also the success in driving the Americans out, were achieved in the Paris Agreement, which significantly changed the situation on the battlefield in the South. Now, the Thieu regime had to rely on its own strength to survive without American troops in Saigon. The U.S. also had to continue pouring money into Thieu to maintain the regime and demonstrate its commitment to its facing a great opportunity to complete the goal of defeating the puppet regime. The Paris Agreement in 19 opened the door to national reunification. Music